All right, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Jesse Pattison, and I'm a summer assistant with the World Water Week team. Thank you for joining us for our last convener training for the 2023 World Water Week. We are here today with Brian and Philip from GSMA, and they will be sharing their experiences on what makes online events engaging and impactful. So during this presentation, you will be muted, but feel free to type your questions into the chat and I can read them to Brian and Philip during breaks, or my colleagues can also type a response in the chat to you. Also at the end of the presentation, there will be a Q&A where you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask your questions directly. And with that being said, I'll hand it over to Brian and Philip. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Jesse, and thanks for the chance to be part of this webinar. And we are quite excited to be a key collaborating partner with CIWI for this year's World Water Week. So a brief round of introductions. My name is Brian Jeroge, and I'm an insights and advocacy analyst at the GSMA, working on building evidence and advocating for innovative solutions to solve challenges in urban service provision. Just a bit about my background. Most recently, I was a partnership and communication officer at a global health foundation based in Washington, DC, and have experiences in consulting and finance in Kenya, Guatemala, Uganda, and the US. I will hand over to my colleague, Philip, for them to introduce themselves too.
Great, thank you, Brian. Hi, everyone. My name is Philip Ramgobin. I am the Senior Marketing Manager here at the GSMA. I've been at the GSMA for just over 7.5 years. I am currently responsible for all marketing for the Digital Utilities program. I also have overarching responsibility for our climate tech program. I have had the good fortune of being able to work on almost every program that sits under mobile forward development, which has been hugely beneficial for me. Prior to working at the GSMA, I have worked in the education, the market intelligence, and the financial services sectors. So back over to you, Brian.
Thanks, Philip. Yeah, and next slide, please. So just a bit about the GSMA and who we are. I think it's Ramon that before we jump into discussing how to generate attendance and engagement, I guess it's very nice to just provide a brief overview of who we are and what we do. And so the GSMA is a global organization unifying the mobile ecosystem. And within the GSMA, we have the Mobile for Development team, which is positioned at the intersection of mobile and the development sector to stimulate innovation and impact for the underserved. Within M4D, there are a few programs which Philip mentioned some of them, and all have different offerings, and these range from agri-tech to climate tech to digital inclusion, mobile for humanitarian innovation, and digital utilities, which is a team where Philip and I sit. Our program supports urban resilience in low and middle income countries by enabling access to affordable, reliable, safe, and sustainable urban utility services through digital solutions and innovative partnerships. We work across a range of sectors, including energy, water, sanitation, waste management, and transport. And we do this in a couple of ways, which I'm going to discuss in the next slide. Our work would not be possible without the immense support of the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. Next slide, please. So how we are able to do this is through 4 activities. And we de-risk and catalyze innovative urban services through the GSMA Innovation Fund. This fund offers grants of between £100,000 to £250,000 to support innovators to scale their solutions. And I will share more on this later. We also engage in research and insights, publishing reports and blogs on varying topics. For example, we publish a report on water utility digitalization in low and middle income countries during experiences from the Kenyan water sector, where we aim to address the evidence gap in how solutions such as mobile money, the Internet of Things, IoT, and platforms, among others, are impacting water utilities. We examined the journeys of 4 Kenyan water utilities, and through detailed case studies and interviews with key players, we were able to identify important lessons and opportunities. We've also published reports in other areas, such as a toolkit for startups in the utility sectors, providing a conceptual framework on how to think through a partnership, and practical tips and tools to navigate these complex public-private partnerships. We also have a two-part report that we published in April that outlines the opportunities of IoT and prevents and what it prevents for achieving development outcomes, with the first part highlighting IoT use cases in areas such as climate change, but also in key sectors including agriculture, energy, health, and transportation. The second part of this IoT report reviews the extent to which 17 key utility forecast use cases have been deployed across 5 markets, and assesses the state and maturity of deployments in India, Indonesia, Kenya, Nepal, and Nigeria, which are all markets that we're working. Lastly, we have done a report outlining the landscape of the transport sector in African cities and the opportunity of innovation in transforming the sector. And this report covers key use cases where digitalization is shaping the mobility sector. We also explore funding and financing trends in the sector and what this means for the digital adoption journey. So as I've mentioned, some of these things we do quite a couple, or we work in quite a couple number of sectors, and all these reports and others are available under the resources page on our website. Apart from our research, we also facilitate partnerships and we convene events such as our MWC series, most notably the Mobile World Congress Barcelona, which happens annually and has an attendance of about 90,000 people every year. Finally, as the global solution for the mobile industry, we offer technical advice to mobile operators and other stakeholders. Next slide, please. As I mentioned about the innovation funding, I'll give a brief overview of what we've done so far with the innovation funding. And through our program, we have awarded 53 grants in total, with 23 of these grants being in water and sanitation. And through the grants, the organizations have impacted over 6.5 million people globally. And one of our key indicators of success is follow-on funding, and these organizations have gone on to raise 295 million pounds in energy and 9.6 million pounds and 4.4 in water and sanitation, respectively. Next slide, please. So now I will move on to discussing what's core to this webinar, and our intention is to share best practices on what has worked for us when planning events, and highlighting what we have done before, during, and post-event to build engagement. So before the event, think about what you would want to achieve from the session, and this is what is your objective. So would your objective be sharing about your organization and the kind of work you do, or would it be to understand what is happening in the field, or is your intention to convene different stakeholders and learn from each other? So it's always key to keep the objectives in mind when preparing for your session at all times. And based off the objective, how then do you weave the event theme into your session? For example, this year's World Water Week theme is on the seeds of change around innovative solutions for our waterways world. So how does this theme fit into your goals, and what work of yours will link to the theme? It's also quite important to ensure that your topics are relevant to the wider theme and appeal to like a broad range of audiences who will be attending the event itself. Next slide, please. Yeah, so once you've identified your objectives, you'd want to answer what is the format and the flow, and how, and this is how do you then structure your session. Given that this year's World Water Week is hybrid, the format will differ across on-site, online, and hybrid sessions. And having this in mind, you'll then know how long your session is and how to segment the time to be able to achieve your objectives. From our experience, we have learned that having a couple offerings in a session breaks down the monotony and increases audience engagement. Additionally, the more the sections, the more opportunities there are to engage the audience during the transitions. So for example, during one of our online sessions, we had a keynote speech followed by a fireside chat, as well as a panel session. And all this was fit within 75 minutes. So based on the structure you have chosen, you'll also be able to decide on whether you have time to share housekeeping rules on the right channels to use for comments and questions, which then ensures that there's effective interactions, and whether you'll use presentations, visual aids, and other forms of media to keep the session alive. Next slide, please. Yeah, so once you've decided on the format, it's then time to choose who will present and who will speak. And some of the questions that we tend to ask ourselves as a GSMA is who are the experts in the theme and the field. So find speakers who can speak to the topic in hand and are well versed in the recent sectoral developments. Who do you have a strong relationship with? So speakers who are aware of your work and how it relates to the topic are able to actively engage in the discussion, and who has a name recognition or areas of influence. Well, this is not necessarily needed. Thought leaders whose contribution will be valuable to the topic can be beneficial, as they'll build more interest around the session itself. And again, based on the format, you'll decide on how many speakers you will have. Too many might be too many, and too little might be too little. So like finding a balance between that is key. And now I will turn to my colleague, Philip, to continue from here.
Great, thank you, Brian. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Excellent, thank you. So how do you attract the right audience? How do you get the right people to register for and attend your event? I'm going to split my answer into two parts, and this applies to both online and offline events. The first part looks at who your event is for, and it might sound like a really basic, obvious point, but knowing your audience is essential. The reason it's essential is because ultimately, the better you know your audience, the better you'll be able to tailor your communications, your marketing, your outreach to match what you know about them, ensuring therefore that the content you share, your promotion, everything that you do has the best chance of achieving your objectives, which, as Brian mentioned, are obviously really important. And in many cases are going to be, how do we get people to register for the event? But they could also be things like, how do we build relationships with organizations that attend our events? How do we share our information and our content and our resources with them? So the first part here that I want to look at is in terms of, I'm going to refer to it as acquisition and retention. So what do I mean by this? Essentially, I mean people that you already engage with versus those who may not and may not already know you and that you want to attract to your work or your event. So what do you know about your audience? Let's start with demographics. And again, we'll all be relatively familiar with these, but I'll give some examples. What do I mean by this? I mean things like, what organization are the people that you want to attract part of? What kind of organization is it? What's their job title? What's their seniority? What sector or industry do they work in? Where are they based in terms of geographical region and country? Are you aware of any topics or themes that are of interest to them or that they have expressed interest in, as an example? There are other demographic types. These are just a few examples that I've given here. Then the second part is what I'd refer to as usage and consumption behavior. And this is where the marketing really starts to come in. So what kind of device types do you know that the people who engage with your content with use? What time of day do you tend to find that they engage with you the most? How long do they spend doing so? I'm sure we're all familiar with things like time on page in Google Analytics as an example. What local language do they use? And therefore, what language do they tend to engage with your content in? What channels and platforms do they use, such as social media, email, and so on? What kind of content types do they interact with the most? Examples could be video, it could be podcasts, it could be webinars, PDFs, blog articles, and so on. Essentially, what I'm getting at here is, how do they engage with you? What methods, what approaches, what styles work for them when it comes to them engaging with you and your content? And as I mentioned, all of this is intended to facilitate you knowing and understanding your audience, which ultimately helps you achieve your objective. Now, the other part that I mentioned here and I wanted to talk about is knowing your audience is one part, but how do you reach them? So there are several ways to do this. One of the most important of which is going to be your data sets, your marketing segmentation. So within your CRM systems, within your data management platforms, you may have a series of different data segments that could apply across a range of different scenarios. So you may have data sets that are specific to one particular topic, one particular part of your business or your organization, one particular theme. You may have a separate segment in your CRM system that is for something separate but related. You could have a third or fourth or fifth segment that actually covers multiple different topics. And these will be your primary ways of being able to reach out and contact or promote your event to. The second part, and this is something that's worked really, really well for us at the GSMA, particularly for the Digital Utilities Programme, is leveraging partner networks. What do I mean by that? I mean, we have some really strong connections and relationships with a variety of organizations that operate within the same spaces that we do. And given that, it allows us and them to share information freely with each other, which can sometimes help and facilitate promotion of pieces of content, material, and in this instance, events. So as an example, if we are running a webinar of our own, what we may do is we may produce what we refer to as a marketing toolkit. And that will have a variety of different pieces of information about said event in it, including promotional content like social media posts, email articles, links to relevant resources. We'll share that with our partner network, with our partners, and they can then use that to share with their networks. So if we've got a webinar that's, let's say, running in 2 weeks' time, and we've produced a series of social media content around it, that marketing toolkit will contain it. We'll pass it to our partner networks. They can then use that to share it on theirs and so on. Obviously, this works in both directions as well. So we've been able to do that for our partners too. As I'm sure you can guess, that helps you amplify your reach arguably exponentially. The more partners you share it with, the more networks you've got to reach, the more people you're ultimately being able to engage with, and then maybe beyond what you currently have, for example, in your marketing segmentation. There's another part to this which is related, which is also the speakers that you've chosen, those that are presenting and those that are speaking at your event. It's almost certain that they have their own audiences, and the point there is, how can you utilize those just in the same ways you might utilize partner networks? So for the same marketing toolkit that I mentioned earlier, you could share that with them, and that then allows them to share and promote the event themselves on their platforms via their channels, their accounts. And again, that is another method of amplifying your reach, helping you to reach more people, which ultimately, therefore, hopefully drives up attendance and registration for your events. The final thing I want to mention here as regards this part about the audience is what platforms and channels can you use to share your event on? And as mentioned before, where do your audience go for their information? So going back to what I said about knowing your audience and understanding where they go, what do they engage with, what do they look for? If you know that, then you can obviously ensure that you use the relevant and matching platforms, channels that you have to share your information on. So it could be, for example, that you know your audience are very active on LinkedIn and they tend to engage quite a lot with your posts on there. That may then inform your marketing strategy so that you can decide, well, we know that LinkedIn is where we want to share our event information. That's where we're going to focus our efforts on. Okay, so I think we can now move on to the next slide, please. So how do you prepare for your events? Again, this is relevant for offline and online, and I'm sure we've all engaged in multiple aspects of this. And I'll start with practice run and tech tests. So whether it is an online event or an offline event, it is often really useful to run a practice session or a rehearsal, if you choose to refer to it like that. That can allow you to identify a variety of obstacles, challenges, ways to change maybe the format and the flow if you find that it doesn't work. It allows you to adjust things before you get to the actual event itself, and really gives you the opportunity to work out any issues that you might run into. Related to that is obviously a tech test. Now, again, this does apply to offline and online, in that for online, it's really, really important that this happens, because This gives you the opportunity to get your speakers onto the relevant platform that you're using. That could be anything from Zoom to Microsoft Teams to a variety of other platforms, and ensure that they're able to log in, to register, to sign up, to attend as they need to, based on the role that they're playing. But it also allows you to test various aspects of the technology to make sure it all works, which I'll talk about shortly. In terms of the actual event itself, it's always a good idea to ask that your speakers and panelists join about 15 minutes in advance. It's something that we at the GSMA have been doing for about a year and a half, almost 2 years, I think now. And we've been doing that based on our own learnings, that we found that it was really useful to have everybody present beforehand to make sure that everyone was able to connect, everyone was able to hear each other, and the vocals and audio were all coming through appropriately, that we run through, and we had run through the flow, the format, the order of the event, how everything was going to work essentially. We found that to be really useful. You might find that half an hour is better, so that can also work, but having people join before has been very beneficial for us. Now I'm going to get into some of the more detailed aspects of how you prepare in terms of the events themselves. And again, a lot of this is going to be really familiar to most of you. I'm sure in some instances has probably provided some interesting interactions. So backgrounds, this obviously applies mainly for online events. And for us, we have found that having backgrounds that feel or seem authentic, genuine, or having individuals present in what might otherwise be their natural environments has been quite useful for us. You could also look at it as providing authenticity and a level of credibility to what people are saying, if they're shown to be in scenarios that are relevant to them, that are relevant to what they're talking about, that are relevant to their work. So that's what we've been trying to do. However, there are multiple organizations out there that may very well have marketing guidelines on what background should be used. Obviously, where that applies, that's what should be followed, because there may, for example, be logos that need to be shown in the background or certain scenarios and so on. For offline events, it's important to think about this as well in slightly different terms, in that you may have a background that requires artwork. There may be opportunities for you to showcase banners or posters or other material in the background or on the stage at the event. So also really worth being aware of that and paying attention to that where possible. Again, this applies particularly for marketing and branding, where it comes to logos, positioning, messaging, taglines, and so on. The next one, background noise. So again, I'm sure we were all familiar with this, but it's really important to try and ensure as much as possible that, certainly for online events where you've got speakers that are attending, that they try their best to minimize background noise. Headphones can be really useful for this and can be quite helpful. At the same time, testing the vocals and audio, really important as well. So this will come up usually in the practice run and the tech test. Can everybody hear everybody else? Are their voices coming through correctly? Is everything audible, essentially? Arguably the most important that comes next is your internet connection. So is it stable? We've certainly run into some scenarios where that may not have been ideal and we've had to work around it, but it's always best, again, when it comes to the practice run and tech test, that you do everything you can to ensure that everybody is able to have a stable internet connection so that there are no issues during the event. Obviously, it doesn't necessarily apply to offline events. And then the final point, which Brian has discussed and mentioned a little bit already, how will questions be handled? And again, this will come up both in your agenda and the way that you set up the format and the flow for the event, but also it will come up during your practice run or your rehearsal. So how would you handle questions? Are questions going to be answered every few minutes? Are they saved until the end? Will you delegate each question to an individual based on the topic or theme? Are you going to suggest that attendees actually address their questions to a specific individual at a specific point? Always worth looking at those different points and trying to understand and agree how best to do it. That also applies to offline events. So for example, you may be in a scenario where there are mobile microphones and you may have a support member of staff who is able to walk around with a microphone and share it with a member of the audience who can then ask a question. Again, always worth looking at how that's going to work, ensuring that all speakers are briefed and prepared and that they understand what they're looking to do and how that will be handled. So I think we can now move on to the next slide, please. Great. Finally, on this part of the presentation, how can you keep your audience engaged? Some of you may have already been thinking about that during this presentation. So Brian has mentioned some of this already. Your format and the flow will facilitate that. You already have considered aspects of this prior to the actual event itself, and therefore this shouldn't necessarily be an issue. But some things that are worth looking at, certainly when it comes to online events, are what functionality have you got available to you that can keep your audience engaged? What can draw them in? What can help them feel immersed and integrated in the event that you're running? Chat can be really, really useful. Obviously, it does require moderation and it does require some rules and regulations around it, but it can allow individuals in the audience to introduce themselves, to share a bit about themselves and where they work and what they do. Equally, from your side, it gives you the opportunity to communicate with them, sharing resources, information, relevant hyperlinks, email addresses for questions and so on. So chat can be one way of keeping your audience engaged. Q&A, I believe we've covered a few times already, so I think that probably answers itself, but ultimately Q&A can also be useful for prompting thoughts and ideas and suggestions around what has been discussed in your presentation, in your event. Definitely worth thinking about how Q&A can provide that continuous engagement. Something that we've looked at is the use of polls and different media. So we have used polls once or twice, and there are a variety of different forms of technology that you can do that with that are all worth looking at and exploring. Equally, we've looked at things like using videos during events, whether that's online or offline. And again, this will come up in your tech test, both for online and offline. Can you run a video via the software already on the device you're using? Does it need to be integrated into the presentation or the content you've supplied? Definitely worth looking at that, because videos can be a really good method of keeping your audiences engaged, but giving them something else to look at, to understand, to engage with. And the final point here, which is an overarching point around really everything I've said on this particular slide, is continuous interaction throughout an event can really keep attention focused. We all know that we live in an environment and society and a world now where there are so many different methods and ways for you to engage with different aspects of your roles, of your personal lives as well. Everyone's got multiple devices, and it's really important that we try our best to, certainly when it comes to events, provide ways to keep audiences engaged, and continuous methods of that or forms of that throughout your event can really help focus the attention and keep people engaged. So I think we can now move on to the next slide, and I believe I'm going to be handing back to Brian for the first part of this.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. But before we move on, I just wanted to check if there are any questions so far. Jesse, I'm not sure if there's any comment with the chat, but also feel free to drop the questions there in the Q&A section.
Yeah, I can read the questions from the chat. So Jan is interested to learn about the interactive possibilities for a session that is both online and physical. It's at World Water Week, and what tools are on the platform. Jan, we'll share the World Water Week inbox email with you. We'll drop it in the chat here, and we can provide a better answer to you, as well as we will also share the Convenor Success Programme. And then in the Q&A, there is a question. Hi, Brian and Jesse. It is my first time to be a speaker in World Water Week this year through an online session. How many participants generally are there in a session? As the sessions can be put in the individual schedule, is there any way to know how many participants there will be in my session? So last year, online sessions averaged about 100 participants per online session. And as for the second part of your question, unfortunately, there is no way to know how many participants have scheduled your session into their calendar. That's just because we don't ask them to register. And back to you, Brian.
Sure. Thanks, Jesse. And maybe just to add on to what you've said from the question in terms of like the online sessions, we hosted 2 online sessions last year, and obviously like the number varies, one based on the topic that you will be presenting, but also we noticed that one of our sessions, like let's say, had a key focus on the Asian region, and so based on the timing, then you will get to have like a larger audience for like from the region of interest, and I think Siwi does a really nice job in being able to allocate time slots based on the audience that the internet audience, but also like the a regional focus. So and I agree with Jess in terms of like 100 average, and yeah, it's always quite nice to see like the number of people that Siwi is able to attract, since like the online section or like sessions are free. Yeah, and it's always also nice to see like the large number of audiences from low and middle income countries, which most of our programs are working. Just to move on, in terms of how can you keep the conversation going on, we've so far discussed how to build engagement ahead and during the event. So what can you do post-event? So on the first part, we try to think of post-event engagement, or is there any content you would want the audience to engage with? For example, we've done events around our report publications, and we will make sure that we direct the audience to where they can read the reports, but also the objectives of most of the events that we do or sessions that we have is making sure that we are able to build a relationship with the audience, but also offer any follow-up opportunities. So providing an avenue for the audience to follow up is quite helpful. And in this case, in case someone has any questions or would like to take the conversation offline, you can provide either an email or the link to a contact form on your website. Again, it's also key to mention what kind of opportunities exist, so as to make sure that the audience is able to reach out with the appropriate asks and requests. Yeah, I think I'll now let Philip take over the next part of the slide.
Great, thank you, Brian. So related to that, in terms of your post-event content, it can, and it has certainly for us, been a significant driver for continued engagement with the audience that attended. It can facilitate, again, building those relationships, expanding your network, and keeping those that are engaged with you coming back to you, coming back to your content, coming back to engage with you. So the first point here is, what can you produce either from the event or that is related to it? And this is something that you may have already thought about, and it's worth planning in advance before the event even happens. So you may think to yourself, it would be really useful if we actually recorded a video at said event that will include sections of what we do or what we have done at the event. It could be the recording of your webinar or your event online or offline. Thinking about what that content looks like is really important, because once you've decided, you can then produce that post-event, share it with the attendees, and that can then, again, engender those additional conversations. It can keep the interaction going. It can keep them coming back and engaging with you in the future. It doesn't have to be video. It could be, and this is something that we've certainly done and found quite good success with, is post-event blogs. So if you have recently held an event and you feel that it would be useful to produce a blog that highlights the key takeaways or the most important points, or produces insights and interesting points that were raised during the event, it's worth thinking about whether you could produce a blog. It could be an infographic, it could be a PDF. There are multiple ways to do this, but the overarching point is, what can you produce post your event, post your session, post your webinar, that is related to it, that can really re-engage people, certainly for those that attended, but also that for those that didn't, what can you share with them so that they can still benefit from what you held and what you participated in. The next part might seem obvious, but how do you share that with your audience? So this will relate back to some of what I said earlier, and this is where your marketing comes back in really heavily, which is knowing your audience. What's the best way to share it with them? What are the best channels to use? How are they most likely to engage with that? Again, all considerations are worth looking at here. And the final part, which again has proved to be really interesting for us, is when is the best time to do so? We've certainly found that recency in terms of sharing post-event content is actually really important. We did find that approximately for us around 4 weeks after an event was actually when content tended to get the least traffic and was really falling off in terms of engagement, whereas up to 2 weeks is where we found the highest peaks in terms of traffic. So for us, we found that recency after an event was really important, and therefore when we choose to produce content post-event, we always try to make sure that it's published, it's available, it's made accessible as soon as possible after the event, ideally up to 2 weeks afterwards, but generally no more than that, as we have found that our audience tends to have moved on by that point and maybe looking at other things, maybe engaging with other things, or that they may just be spending their time elsewhere on other stuff. So recency is really quite important on that point. And ultimately, I think that I'll hand back over to Brian here.
All right, next slide, please. And thank you, Philip. Yeah, so we've come to the end of our presentation, and we are thankful for you all for tuning in. And in case you'd like to stay in touch, we have our emails on screen, and feel free to reach out to us. As I mentioned, we also have a couple of resources that may be helpful, and we have also included a link that will direct you to our resources and our blogs too. I will now hand over here to Jesse to see if there are any questions. And yeah, at this point, feel free to unmute and ask any questions that you might have. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, I've just changed the settings, so I believe whoever wants to unmute themselves can at this point. If you just maybe raise your hand and I can call on you if you have a question. And of course, you can also type your question in the chat if you would like. Okay, I see some hands being raised. So why doesn't Dr. DeBalaco Singh, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, and then Liz afterwards.
Thank you for your presentation. And I just wrote my question in the chat box because we are going to present a video in a video session on 20th of August in the evening. And there are other 3 presenters. So our story is about a piped water scheme which was installed in a place where there is no road, no electricity, no water supply. So that is the story. My question is actually, we were thinking that we may bring some posters or X banners or some of our printed materials for display, whether there will be scope and space for that type of materials. And if we bring a kind of post X banner, whether there will be any stand to fix that in this session. And second thing is whether we are allowed to bring at least another 1 speaker for our session, whether that is allowed or not. That's all.
Yeah, so I would suggest, I don't know off the top of my head, but I would just suggest emailing the World Water Week inbox. I'll share that email in the chat, and we can get back to you with a more clear answer. And in your email, please include your session ID number. That will help us a lot too, and we can get back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and Liz?
Yes, thank you, for the presentation. I had a few questions regarding the session. So mine is a 30-minute webinar. And I wanted to know, will we get access to the people who are registering beforehand? And then also on the day, do we get somebody from World Water Week to participate as someone who can help in case of any technical hitches and stuff like that? And sorry if I missed the answers because I've not been part of the other sessions. Thanks.
Yeah, so list the people who will participate. The list will not be available to you, unfortunately, just because we don't ask them, the attendees of World Water Week to like register for each session. So there isn't a way to know which sessions that they will attend. And the second reason is because of some privacy laws, we can't release that information. And then, sorry, the second part of your question was about help, like technical help from World Water Week, I believe. And yes, you will have access. So 20 minutes before your online session, there'll be the green room where you'll have access to Trippus AV technician. They're our digital host or digital platform provider. So they will be able to help. And in the green room, there'll also be a World Water Week volunteer and also a 20 Studios technician for if there's a on-site component as well. But you can also feel free to email the World Water Week inbox.
Okay, all right, thanks. And maybe just one last question in terms of marketing the event. Will World Water Week also like do posts specific to promote different sessions, or is that solely like our responsibility as conveners?
So marketing, so there's in our Convenor Success Program, we actually have some training webinars just like this one. The first one that was posted discusses some tips and tools for promoting your session. Yeah, it's not like World Water Week's responsibility to promote. We'll provide some tools that you can use, and yeah, that's yeah, the answer.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
I just in the chat.
Oh, there's questions in the chat. All right. So we are not able to see who signs up in advance for online sessions. So how are we able to customize the sessions for the audience? Do you guys have any suggestions for that, Brian?
Yeah, sure. Like happy to take that. So, well, you might not be able to see who's actually attending your event or your session ahead of the event. I think it's key to sort of visualize or have an idea of who would be interested in the session based on the topic and the theme. So, for example, we have had a session before on digitalizing utilities, and just off of that, at least we know one that innovators who work with utilities will be interested in attending. Two, we know that financiers who work in the space might be interested in the topic, but again and again, utilities themselves will want to learn how to move from the analog aspect of their work towards digital. And so just based on sort of having this segment or like groups of audiences that will be interested, you are then able to tailor the content by one, like let's say like having a speaker who can speak on the experience from a utilities perspective, from a financiers perspective, or from an innovator's perspective. So once you're able to group the kind of audience you'd expect to have, you'll then at least be able to tailor the questions and the content to like these segments of audiences. I hope that answers your question, Belinda.
See, Robin, you have your hand up. Go ahead and ask a question.
Hi, sorry, just get to unmute. Thank you. I have a question related to the Mentimeter. I see that you can use Mentimeter. The last, in 2022, we did an online session and the polls were integrated into the software that we were using. So do you have to use Mentimeter, or is there a way that you can do polls in your session without Mentimeter?
Like you're referring to polls in Zoom, is that right? Yeah, so the problem with the polls in Zoom is that they can only be created once the like the Zoom link, you have the Zoom link and in the green room, and because there's only 20 minutes and there's a lot of checklists that Trippus will be doing and our assistant will be doing with your speakers, it's not recommended to use the polls in Zoom, just to use Mentimeter, because you can make the polls way in advance.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. I'm more familiar with Mentimeter anyway. Thank you.
And then in the chat, I see a question about, well, I see one question just from Belinda. So for CWE, can we revise the program description? Yeah, absolutely. Please just, you can email what you want the description to be to the World Water Week inbox, and I can make those edits, or one of us on our team can make those edits for you, for sure. I see some questions coming in the chat. So the link on the Convenor Success Program on this page doesn't seem to be working for me. I would just, I will pass that along to our tech, our web host engineers, and hopefully we can get that sorted out. Is there anyone who has any questions? Liz, I see your hand is still up. Is it another question, or is it just up from before?
Sorry, it's up from before. Let me lower it.
Okay. Here. Yeah, so I see a question about last year about the polls being integrated into the main platform. Unfortunately, we changed platform providers, so that's why we can't, like the polls won't be in on the digital platform. So yeah, and yeah, I agree with what Robin says, just that suggesting that all presenters have the latest version of Zoom. That's, yeah. If you, we also suggest just checking out our Convenor Success Program. There you'll find a checklist and some tips and tricks that we've posted that I think you guys will find super helpful. But that being said, oh, there is another question in the chat. Is it possible to make some changes in the title and description? Yeah, you can. You can. So, like I mentioned before, you can email your the edits that you want to make to the World Water Week inbox, and I can, or someone from our team can make those edits. You can also, whoever is their session host, they will have a confirmation email, and in that confirmation email, they can log in with their email address and the session ID number, and from there you can make some of the edits as well. So I hope that answers your question. And can you change speakers as well? Yes, but so you can absolutely change speakers. But that is something that cannot be edited by like the session hosts. That's something that you will have to email World Water Week about, and we can make those edits for you for sure. And up to when can the changes be made? I think because the site goes live August 1st, we would recommend that probably by then to be not making edits on the digital platform then. Of course, if situations change, we can edit later or afterwards, but we would really recommend to get the speakers to us ASAP as soon as possible, and we can make those edits. Does anybody have any other questions or that I've missed? I don't see, I see one in the chat. So is there going to be a feature for the audience to pose questions and ask questions in the chat box? Yeah, because there will be, it'll just be a Zoom call just like this. So the audience can pose questions just like this. We recommend that you have like an online moderator who can ask and who can relay the questions from the chat to your speakers. And that way your speakers aren't toggling between the chat box and their presentation, but you can just use the chat on Zoom. And so a question from Ron Govinda. Do you have any recommended templates for presentations? Brian or Philip, is that something you guys want to maybe answer?
I can answer that. I think recommending templates is not something that we can really discuss in this setting, because there are so many different varieties and styles and formats, and multiple organizations will have different approved templates for themselves that will have, for example, their logos in a specific format. They might have a very set way of having headers, footers, how much content should be in the main body, what colors should be used, what font, and so on. So generally speaking, that's not something that I think we can answer directly here. More what I would say to try and answer the question is, I think that when it comes to PowerPoint in particular and presentations generally, it's important to try and focus on not having, certainly in our experience, not having a lot of content on each slide. It's tended to work best for us when we've had a few bullet points, not really more than sort of 5, and that they're not gigantic paragraphs of text, essentially. Visuals are obviously really useful. Animations can be useful. Playing videos can be useful. But outside of ensuring that your content is ultimately a complement to what is being spoken about, there aren't really any suggestions I think that we can give about templates as such. So my overarching point there is, I think it's important probably to focus more on how you're using the presentation itself to facilitate the goals of the event, and that keeping presentations succinct, precise, clear, and where possible, visually engaging has certainly in our experience works really well. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, and then I see some questions in the chat about content. So I will direct those questions to the Convenor Success Programme on the World Water Week website. There you can find everything that you need. And if not, you can email us at worldwaterweek@cwe.org. I will just put this in the chat for everyone to have, just in case you have any questions that weren't answered. But if there's anything else, there's no questions from anyone else, and no one's raising their hands, nothing in the chat. I just want to really thank Philip and Brian for taking this time and for doing this presentation for us. It was fantastic. I hope everyone learned a lot. I also want to thank the participants, you guys, for joining. And we really look forward to seeing you at World Water Week this year. So goodbye.
Thank you, everyone, and all the best in the sessions.
Thank you, everyone.